Our poet tonight is Ed Skoog, and he is the author of 3 books of poems: Mr. Skylight, Rough Day, which was the winner of the Washington State Book Award, and Run the Red Lights, all published by the Copper Canyon Press. He's been a visiting writer at George Washington University, Wichita State University, and the Richard Hugo House. He's received various fellowships, and his poems have appeared in a variety of publications, including Best American Poetry, 2015, Paris Review. He's the poetry editor of Okey Panky.
Not anymore.
Okey Panky, not anymore. We were going to ask you what that was.
We closed that.
You closed that up. Okay. Well, we were going to hear about that, but that's closed. And he's co-host with novelist J. Robert Lennon of the podcast Lunchbox. So that's still happening.
That's still doing one on Sunday.
Okay. So we're maybe going to hear a little about that with Ed and John. He teaches part-time at Portland Community College, Portland State University, the Idlewild Writers Week, and the Attic. Would you join me in welcoming our poet this evening, Mr. Ed Skoog? Ed.
That'll work.
That'll work, okay.
Oh, it's a condenser mic anyway.
Huh?
It's a condenser mic, so it'll pick me up over here, right?
Yeah, wherever you want to
Yeah, it doesn't even have to be up. It's not a directional mic.
No, that'll be fine.
Yeah. I know about this because I play in a hillbilly music band. And we just have one mic, and so we learned how to do this kind of mic, you can have someone over here, over here, over here. It's very handy. Yeah. Thank you all. Thanks for having me, people on the committee and regulars and friends. Good to see Andrea.
You got 2 friends.
2 friends. Well, I like to think I have many friends here now. This intimate space. This also rolls around like the Sean Spicer program. Take use of that. It's nice to be. I haven't spent much time in Milwaukie. My father-in-law grew up here, was born and grew up down here. Mostly associated with Dark Horse Comics. It's a great local literary institution whose founder and owner, I think, is taller than me. So I hope I never meet him. It's nice to see you. I would like to read some poems from the most recent book, Run the Red Lights, and then some more recent poems that are from a book called Travelers Leaving for the City, which will be published next year by Copper Canyon. Never figure out what to read until I get up in front of people. I take a measure of everybody, see how everybody's feeling.
Good measure.
Pretty good. I'll skip to the advanced work. I'll start with the little poem "Hurry," which is on the little little broadside. It's very nicely printed. Short poem. That was genesis of it was from a similar little broadside that Tavern Books, if you're familiar with it, a little poetry press out of actually their offices in Union Station up in Portland. They publish out of print translations of poetry. It's a real niche. Publishing poetry at all puts you kind of in the margins. And then publish translations, it's a little another margin. And then really only things that have been published and are out of print of translations. It seems like it's probably a CIA front, right? Now I say it out loud, it just doesn't sound plausible. One of the things, they have a great, it's a great press, and they have a great sense of design, and they occasionally make ephemera, and they did a series of poems from translations from Thomas Tranströmer, the Swedish poet who won the Nobel who they have, who the editors of that press were acquainted with. And I just admired them, and so I imitated them, and this was one of the imitations. And I didn't end up crediting it because because when I looked back at the original after revising it 100 times, and I couldn't see any relationship to the original poem, except that's where it began. So it's nice to see it returning to the 5x8 form. Hurry. This is how winter passes. The baby plays with a mirror. There's nothing outside he knows. Branches open in the hedge. People drive long distances. The world's face is half in shadow, like his. He wakes, is fed, sleeps again. Outside rages and deepens. In the mirror, the baby returns to the two-player game, each time becoming more and less familiar. I wrote a lot of these poems in this book, and I assume that some of you write poetry or are engaged in some sort of creative sport, and know that it has its cadences. Sometimes you kind of dedicate yourself to it, and then kind of nothing comes for a while, and then once in a while you'll have a intense period where sort of everything kind of works out for an hour or a week or a month. And I had a good month. I was living in Missoula, Montana in 2012, where I have he's 6 now, but he was very young, and we had 2 hours of daycare, maybe 2.5, and it was the most productive period of time in my life, that having had no time like that for a number of years, and then suddenly to have an hour here, an hour there. I wrote most of the book in those periods. Because I'd been kind of an art for art's sake, scribble in notebooks kind of guy from the time I was 9 when I started writing poems, and then once in a while would type, find the poem inside of it or type it up, or had the leisure to find something from August that matched with something from April. But then when I had less time, as a parent kind of with primary custody, because that sounds like a different arrangement, as the primary at-home parent, I found that I had to basically compose the poems in my head. And then when I had a moment to, kind of write them down. And that was a different sort of thing. It created a different kind of poetry. Suddenly it created a poetry that made sense, or halfway made sense, because in order to remember it, I had to make sense. Right? When you're writing kind of abstract expressionist poetry, you don't have to remember it. It doesn't have to make sense. It can be purely enjoyable to the writer. But so suddenly I had to things in this poem make sense. Now that my son is older, my poems have mostly returned to their previous state of near meaninglessness. But it's sort of like Flowers for Algernon, kind of briefly I was a genius and went back to where I had been. Most of the poems in the book have to do with parents and children. This poem is called Run the Red Lights. When my mother sent me for cigarettes, I'd buy a candy bar too, sign her name to the book, and walk out with the green and white carton, Virginia Slims 100s, under my arm, the chocolate already gone. Sugar, my God, like newspaper cartoon panels spread out on the kitchen table, where I'd pretend to smoke, imitating her. After the corner store closed, we made our groceries at Dillon's, joined the impersonal. A villain snatched her purse there when I was away at college, and on the phone she told me excitedly how Topeka police, is my hometown, Topeka, Kansas, how Topeka police chased the culprit, and she named each street, each intersection and landmark, the whole adventure, just for her. I'm grateful now to the sedentary house, although I've grown as large on candy as John Candy. My older brothers left home and our meals stayed the same. A skillet high with beef stroganoff, pot roast in broth, chili con carne, cheese sandwiches with mayo, flocks of fried chicken. And then the whole house went on a diet of cold tofu cubes, a broken disc of lemon in a water glass, cottage cheese measured onto lettuce. And then back to London broil the next night, no questions asked. We were emotion without form. And I carry it with me, not just in frame, arm, jowl, and belly, but here in the intergalactic space of written thought, the infinite stage where we come to talk to each other. Sugar makes me curious. After Katrina, I lived in New Orleans for a bit, after Katrina, I took the diet where you eat meat and lost almost 100 pounds from a surfeit of bacon, sauteed pork medallions, beef and lamb. The weight fell away like a knight's armor after a joust. I bought shirts at a regular store. I played softball and ran bases, bounded them as if on a new, more forgiving planet. And I went crazy, evened out, broke down again, inconsolable at the finale of 6 Feet Under. Tears for my mother, really, postponed and all the more torrented for the delay. Opening the book of grief requires you read all the way to the end, every time. Driving to work, I stopped bewildered at a gas station, paid cash for 2 Snickers bars that provided more salvation than I have ever known from religion's acres. I write about the West and the South and home, their tenderness and trouble and the weird spirits that break the best days. Still, I find myself down by the river at twilight. On the bridge, deliberate-seeming people walk by like victorious aliens, past the consequential palaces lit as before, their faces turning in their rotisseries. In profile, my mother looked like Alex Chilton, the lead singer of the Box Tops, and then Big Star. You know, the Box Tops are a Big Star. Box Tops. He walked into the recording studio when he was 16 and sang The Letter, having never been in a recording studio before, buy me a ticket on an airplane. Then he had a kind of power pop group in the 70s that was a spectacular failure called Big Star, because they knew they weren't going to be. So in profile, my mother looked like Alex Chilton, lead singer of the Box Tops and then Big Star. I used to see Chilton around New Orleans in line at the grocery store, walking down Esplanade. My mother also had a solo career, playing solitaire and watching her own TV in the kitchen, and dying before everybody else. Dying, Chilton urged his wife to run the red lights, his last words. And when I had to leave my mother in the hospital, that was hard. And then again at the funeral, I set a marble under her folded hands. Don't know why. It's been 10 years, 10 fingers, the closed eye of each knuckle. Each nail its year's fullest day moon. Which of us shed the other? My scar from opening a window, such force to move the wood frame, so little to shatter the glass it held. To be held so again. 10 years, so 40 seasons, 80 endings and beginnings. Well, always a gust in them, which is the sigh of how she would note each leaf and bird. One hand to hold the coffee cup, one the cigarette. The red ember she became at midnight. Red light, I. Ode to the Macarena. You remember the Macarena? Oh, yeah. Just yesterday. This is an ode to it. Ode to the Macarena. It starts with a lie, because I'm standing, but the chair I'm sitting on is mostly nothing. I was sitting when I wrote it, I promise. I'm sitting most of the time. I largely sit. The chair I'm sitting in is mostly nothing. Electrons go right through it. Memory, which is electricity, seems lighter than a scatter, And yet, in the inexplicable universe, I'm there again, and it's now again, summer of the Macarena. 2 months in Abilene, Kansas, and I see nobody in the central air of the Sunflower Hotel. My 8th floor window stares down buttery hills. Street lights pink the tracks downtown like a chalk outline to fill in later. I'm writing a novel set among historians working at the Eisenhower Library. I go to its chapel daily and sit before his tomb, Eisenhower's tomb, and sit before his tomb and then sit in my kitchenette alone in 23. Some weekends I drive to Kansas City where a woman who won't need me lets me stay over. Although at sex I'm still a boy, as at rigorous thinking, naive, unskilled, fascinated by form but lazy about content. But I work the paths that lead me from myself. Ike stays a boy, winning the worst war. As president, little happened that we praise him for. And by we, I mean the characters in the novel, among the adult troubles they fall into that I don't understand. This summer at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, where the man who gives leaves of grass away carelessly will be renominated, the delegates keep doing the Macarena every time I look at the lobby TV. The vice president claims during his speech to be doing the Macarena, but does not move, then offers to demonstrate it again. Presidents are always late in the day of their time. Like dances, our political lives come and go. It's the summer of all dances. Coffee leaping in the percolator, gravity-defiant solitude. And through the window, houses and fields seduced in their own passing crazes of seasons, life and death, which won't need me. Do you remember that summer?
Yes.
Yeah, you remember? No, that's not 68. I'm only 46, so it was the same. It was the, yeah, well, what would that have been? 96, 94, 92, 94, 96.
97 or 98, because I remember that when I was a kid. Yeah, so 98 was the presidential election.
98 was Clinton's second, whatever it was.
It was 96.
96, what had to be 96, right? Because we count by fours. We count by fours. This book came out a week after the most recent presidential election, which was bad timing to publish a book of poems with kind of zippity-doo memories of the Obama years. Nobody wanted to hear about it. But as I look at it, I see that it's as much of the present as it was of the past. The second spider. This book makes references to a lot of music that I don't necessarily care about. But it's useful to mention that this has to do with Peter Frampton and his live album, which was not live, and the talkbox effect that he used. Second spider. To be alive and know it. But let's make this smoother. As through an effects pedal, like the talkbox, used on Frampton Comes Alive. An album I long misunderstood to be playing against the idea of live, and not live at all. Yet a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, when John fact-checked it, he found, he tells me, that it's not true. The album does mix together 4 live shows, but I prefer the way I know it. Last night a painter friend called. His life is falling apart. 1 a.m. He's always calm, but I know he's been getting arrested, kicked out of the house, crashes his car all over town, and walks away. I don't want to call you to report on heartbreak's treacle, although I'm acquiring a bitter tooth. Remember when we talk all night with a foot up on the table, fidgeting with a hole in your gold toe? John says if he can't see someone's face, he'd rather communicate by writing. Faces are important. culture begins there. So happy birthday to you, if you're turning older as we talk. You don't owe anything when wished happy birthday. Birthdays are not ruined cities waiting for jobs to come back. The spiders in the windows observe a rigorous calendar. I wrote this for a while and then put it down. I don't always know whether I'm dead or alive or am merely playing with the idea. I put it down because we had to evacuate the mountain to escape a fire and spend several nights in a hotel in Riverside, California, the Mission Inn, very nice, where I spared a spider with such mercy my rolled-up Entertainment Weekly raised to strike. I thought of commending my goodness, while my son slept safe in a muted sun ray and my wife typed an email. But then I saw a second spider and killed it without a thought. And when I lived in New Orleans, I worked at the Art Museum, New Orleans Museum of Art, which is a nice job. Except you work in a nice place like that, and your office is, you don't know, there wasn't even a poster in my own actual office, let alone, a Chagall. It was kind of a one-upsmanship of people working at the museum to sort of have their actual workplaces as drab and cheerless. In contrast to the otherwise opulent museum. This poem is called Paintings and Drawings. I don't know how to look at art. Others regard an object privately, as if in a changing room. But there's a certain kind of terror I'm trying to outgrow or live beyond. So I apologize for not inviting my boss at the New Orleans Museum of Art, Jacqueline L. Sullivan, to my wedding years ago. Allowing us use of the Grand Hall for free should have earned her a folding chair in any row. Last believer in dignity and the last city to know its texture, she barely paid and made men wear suits which in Gulf haze felt like mops. I loved her, and she was a bully. We all confused her with our mothers. And I was just one more wrong hire among dot matrix and file drawers rolling in their meditations. On Mondays, the museum's closed to the public, and I walked the galleries like a trustee, past one of Picasso's 400 portraits of his young wife, Jacqueline, and Degas' portrait of his sister-in-law, Estelle Mousson Degas, arranging tropical flowers at a table in the family home on Esplanade Avenue, a few blocks away. Degas lived in New Orleans in the 1870s. You can tell that she can barely see the flowers. When he visited, Degas spent his time not painting at the fairgrounds racecourse, betting his cotton money on the local horses. At lunch, I'd walk there too, make a few bets and eat a bowl of white beans and rice, the best in town. I was not painting either. Maybe I'd jot down notes in the margins of the daily racing form up in the press booth where Marcus and Bob covered the races, sitting with the stewards, the former jockeys who watched the races for improprieties, although they could no better than Estelle, through cigarette smoke in their stories, see any improprieties. I remember Bill Hartack, who rode and won the Kentucky Derby 5 times, inquiring about the fishing in places where I'd lived, over and over. Their tips never brought me the money I wanted. It's hard to predict the future. Going back to the museum, I'd see the maintenance staff drinking beer on the banks of the bayou. If at night my coworkers climbed into frames of their own portraits, my love for them would be confirmed. The security chief smelled like lemons and slept in his office, suffered board meetings with a mug of gin. I dealt with board members, uptown types whose seersuckered white supremacy smelled of gardenia, jasmine, and rot. The owly director wore red frames, and when he broke a netsuke, said, "Well, better me than you," while the elderly docents licked envelopes beside the coffee machine. all of us thralled in fear and desire to Jackie's attention. When the city flooded, the museum became an island. Gone by then, I read about it in the New York Times, how Jackie stayed with 3 building engineers as, quote, 2 security guards, 2 maintenance workers, and a secretary, and their families until soldiers forced them out. Guns trump art when the guns are pulled. And here's the ennobling emblem, which makes me ache against her absence at my wedding, how she returned to the museum, commandeered some boat at the edge, and stood at the prow past bodies through unreceding waters. I live in fear of her finding out that I'm still alive and that I wrote a poem about her.
Oh dear.
She's retired now, which just means that she's free to roam about the country. She was a great boss. She was like the administrative director of the museum, but she ran everything. She had 8 brothers, 8 younger brothers, all named J.L. Sullivan, all named in some form after the boxer John L. Sullivan. She was tough.
She was a JL also, wasn't
Jacqueline L. Sullivan, yeah. And the image on the cover of the book is from a New Orleans painter named Noel Rockmore, whose exhibition I worked on at the museum. And there's other poems about working at the museum. I should have kept that job. I was unqualified for it. It's good to have a job you're not qualified for. Means you might not like it. And if you do work that you like, you won't get paid. Never work for love. I'd like to read some poems from the most recent book. So it's called Travelers Leaving for the City, and it's largely about, or it takes its initiating footprint. I don't think that's a term. But it's about my grandfather was murdered in 1955. I was born in 1971, so I didn't do it. You can cross me off the list of suspects. Well, they found who did it. It was a bystander to an altercation. The family kind of denies that it happened. He had remarried. My grandmother had divorced him in 1930. He was gay, and he was poor. And she didn't know either one of those. I'm not sure which one of those was the greater offense to her. So he was out of the picture and not discussed. I only kind of found out about it after my grandmother died. But it was the case was sensational. There was actually a lot of coverage about it at the time, but I've been able to go back into old newspapers, and I found court transcripts and things like that. Try to find out what happened to the gun. Although, people get murdered all the time. That's not unique or even what's interesting. What's interesting to me emotionally is the effect that it when I say emotionally, I mean selfishly, right? What of that surprise and trauma via my mother affected me, the way that she saw me? I guess that's what it is. I wrote a book about it. I should be able to be more articulate, but it's poetry, so I'm off the hook. But the subject of all of my poems has really been my mother. She was real nice. But I think in my reading and studying poetry, one of my kind of the lines I've studied academically is kind of psychology, Lacanian criticism and theories of the origins of language, and the idea that language begins and therefore poetry begins in the cry of the separation from the mother. So I think, and I've written about this, that the audience for poetry is always the mother, not necessarily your actual biological mother with her social security card walking around or not walking around, but the position that a mother has in your head, your psyche. Right? And then the sort of the conflict between that and maybe the actual person, who is, of course, always must be described as being lovely. This poem, I'll read a couple poems from the middle of the book. Where I like to sit is at the counter. Listen to the kitchen gossip, like train whistles, reading their teleprompters. The cook's politics, the riverside track straightness. What funds may become available for the Dobro's widening slide? The letter carrier punctuates across the street. He knows the door codes. 12 miles a day he walks out of moments, rejects as much as he brings. And they sing, I had a plan to run away after kindergarten. Kept a green pack with selected toys, flashlight, a change of shoes. Only when I asked if I could run away, they said no. So put each object back where it brought the house joy. When it doesn't matter, some people are called lost, but nobody's going very far. Not with this gravity. Not at these prices. The fig tree is a strangler. Cormorants in vile arrangements stagger the fallen dam. I was a child. I go around the houses calling out names. They respond with various stratagems. They sing our masks slip, and in the yard sale, everyone's a stranger. To get through the day with your button, you may need to forget what's disappearing and be like those among us who hear, do your best to ignore what even now is fading, what falls outside of your shirt sleeves. I'm talking to you, grandfather, for the first time, and it is so quiet in this nonce space. You can hear me as hummingbird hears honey. I don't think I can help you. Up from the hallway floor with song, the impression that reading about you has given me, like thought arisen while reading a travel book. Vivid spires and dusk-lengthened roads to forested realms that I'll never see, even if I went, as I cannot go to you, nor any word about you. No word would have been kind, but net to catch the unintended trawl, as gold intrude normalist of basins, and conjured your figure grinds out. They sing something I have been wanting to know about silence as pertains to love. And now we'll turn vine back through lattice as a garment floating uneven down ripple and shadow, a blossom frozen in falling, a flower shop opening its drunk rigors at dawn, the ray undulating around the sheller's finely fanged mushroom fire. As cleat on concrete tap, cleat like shoe cleat. As cleat on concrete tap, I'm sorry, I keep saying it. I'll get it right. As cleat on concrete is tap. Like one's remembered gestures of love make uneven music, and faltering play what once gave push to the grand, now slips around, a sea urchin tuned to K-pop, a seaside market's white linoleum. Table gives a little when you lean against it, and it's dawn. Buyer, for that night's special make, judgment in the dog's first light, as yesterday's stink not fully hosed out. Damaging midnight's property sings at the curb. What was it? What brought you to see another's body and feel desire? What light sings the gobbet sun and shadows that striped the pool? Or was it the dark surprised you entering a bibliography of lost turns between wall and gate? Is it possible shortwave signals range over the oceans? When was it you first knew you were or were not dead? In the hallway, or on the kitchen floor, while the cockatiel squawked, or noticed only its own reflection in birdcage mirror and nothing outside, or woke from dream unsure your path through the world might just be a free trial, an ultimate technique. The figure which Carl said at lunch is like a disc without space or time to commodify it. I think instead is full of slides and trapdoors, a ladder, a song. Don't wrap it up. I'll take it home in my hands. Even though we are down to one lane, what does holding the disc, which is a void, make you forget? The trick with wheels, for the meters run out, even the star map infinite presents a figure that parceling into titles may wall off, match the wood to the old wood, scrap what's instinctively not part of the design. They sing it this way. Use the words about the loss of the figure who would explain the bark, a sap, a pith, leaves, bright fall, and how it is to see the nests in winter, and how it is to smell the burning forests, their ash running away from the mountains. The absence of what we thought mother was and father was when we were small and needed. They sing that escape, play and exit, a pitcher's playlist approaching the mound, and a bass drum to count the steps. She said the show was still going on when she left in a wedding dress. Echoing Colosseum behind her, becoming a moon, as it disappears and instead departing music arrives under her bare feet. Palms grow acres above confetti in her hair. She said, human, before I can pack up my tent and go. How does last night learn morning, or it's morning? Time develops, like any interview will. Read one last poem and then entertain any questions or concerns or revisions. No, I'm going to read the first poem in it. It remotely makes sense. The poem begins kind of with comes off like a fever dream, but actually it's sort of an account of an evening I spent in Sacramento a couple years ago when I was driving. I teach this thing down in Idlewild, California every summer. It's been my 13th summer there. This little poetry workshop, this week-long thing. Which I love. I love it. This year we've got a great group. We've got Terrence Hayes and Gregory Pardlow and Victoria Chang and a lot of great poets and some fiction writers and all that. It's great. But what I love most about it is the drive down and the drive back. Because I'll stop, because it's a 2-day drive, and so I get to stop in a hotel and watch television, which is the highlight of my whole year. 2 nights a year I get to watch TV. So I stopped in Sacramento, and I bought this shirt. And for some reason, the shirt scared me. I'd had the shirt for a couple of months. I had only worn it once. It was a normal shirt. But I think I had it hung up on the back of the... I just had it hung up, and it looked ominous. It was a terrifying shirt suddenly. And so I went out into the city to get rid of it. Figured out how to properly dispose of this scary shirt, which I know sounds silly, but it was important I get rid of this shirt. I was not going to be able to sleep. I realized I would not be able to sleep in the same building as this shirt, if I ever slept at all. Sometimes something just kind of seems off about a thing, right? I sound a little crazy, don't I? Well, that's why it disturbed me, is because I'm really quite sane. I wouldn't hurt a fly. they see me.
But a second spider.
A second spider, yeah. Anyway, but once I got rid of the shirt, the entire architecture of this book was suddenly crystal clear to me. I can't explain that or defend it, but it's true. So, even though I'd been writing the book for a while, this is where I wanted to begin it. I grabbed the shirt off the hook on my way out into the night and bore it past the cathedral where a wedding was being swept up and offered it to the man falling asleep against the embankment. He said it wasn't his and waved me down the alley. The shirt made a face and made me want to wear it. I said maybe in the morning. Then as the rat chattered under the car, I set it on the piano and hurried back towards my own losses, keys alternating with shadow, the white of a parasite bird's hunger. And on the wind I heard the silkworms, a thread maker, a tailor, telling me that around the corner a horrible infant would be calling my name, and was. Only it was the emptiness of generations, and a vine coming unglued from a downspout. So I had to remember suddenly the password that lets and lets and lets until there is no more permission. Silhouette imprecisely blesses each footstep with light rain. So I'll leave it off there. More of a place to begin than end, but
What was the last line again?
good question.
Rain is the last word.
Yeah, as it should be in any text.
Of course, especially here.
Yeah, walking off into the rain, right? Almost every novel ends with somebody walking off into the rain, right?
We should start one that way.
Yeah. The silhouette imprecisely blesses each footstep with light rain. Well, this is, you know about light rain. Yeah, Tom.
Well, two questions really. One is I wanted to ask you about your writing practice. And you talked about writing a little bit. But just when do you write and how does that work? And then you talked about TV. So I wanted to ask you about if you have TV at home. Just
We don't have a TV at home.
what's your
I've never watched that much TV. I watched a lot of it when I was a kid, less than other kids.
yeah.
And then I just didn't have one in college, and I've just never really had one. There have been some shows that I as a person in 2018, I have almost unlimited access constantly to anything I want to watch on my phone or something. Sometimes when I'm working, I'll put on The Sopranos, like off of Netflix or whatever I have it on, and just listen to it. And I've been writing that way for a long time, mostly as background, not because I love it or think about it. It's just sort of white noise. I've never really had a writing practice. I never really had a consistent way of doing things. I'll write one way for a month or something, but I'm just not organized enough to have a regular way of doing things. I like to have a notebook. I like to have a coffee shop I go to. I like to have time to write. I like to write in the morning. I like to write late at night, but I don't have a real system for it. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to say one thing and then follow up with a question. I'm hearing your poetry for the first time. It's really kind of extraordinary to me. There are these moments in listening to your poems where you recite these beautiful lines. I can't remember them verbatim. There was one about the music under her feet. It just, my mind just was trying to, that was so beautiful. And then the other one was about a picture frame of friends being capsulized in a picture frame. It was just, there's these, and then you kind of seem like set people up because it's building, and then toward the end there's this beautiful exit that just brings it all together. And I just really enjoyed that as I listened to it.
thank you for saying that. Thanks for describing those
And the
moments in that way.
Second one I had was more of a question. I couldn't recall all the names, but you mentioned Terrence Hayes
Mhm.
for 13 years you were doing workshop. The poets that you mentioned are more the kind of premier poets of today, I would think, if I heard the names right. What do you find extraordinary about them? What makes a Terrence Hayes extraordinary as a poet today? Because he has quite a bit of acclaim today.
Well, for Terrence specifically, I think it's kind of a fierce independence. And I've known Terrence for 20 years, and he's always been brilliant. He works really hard on his poems, and he enjoys writing them. One thing he does, he still does this to this day. He tackles significant things. This new book, which is coming out, this American Sonnets book. It's very, very meaningful. But for him, he's kind of a puzzle maker, right? He gets the paper, and he gets this. I don't know if this is public knowledge. I don't feel like it's not an expose. Whatever the opposite is, like an expose that's not very interesting, is like he'll do like the wordy-gurdy or take the crossword or something, every day, almost every day. I mean, in my knowing of him, he writes early in the morning, and he just kind of finds some puzzle to work out in, maybe it's 10 lines or 20 lines, but often it'll be kind of received things like the words that happen to be in the crossword that day, or the word scramble or something, and he'll find from these materials a way into his intellect and his subconscious and his heart, which are all quite considerable. So I think his kind of independence and the joy that he takes in writing, I think, which I think you could claim almost any poet does that. But knowing a lot of poets, I'd say I know a lot of poets who don't seem to enjoy it at all. And you can kind of tell, even if they're good. You can read Terrence, though, this gives me a great deal of pleasure and is challenging. And I can tell that there's something charming in the spirit of it, and in the sentiment, and just the language. There's a grace to it that is very specific. Pardlow is very good. Pardlow's all intellect. We were roommates for a couple of years in D.C., and we watched TV. We watched a lot of Law and Order. We ate a lot of cold pizza, and worked on poems. He's a great poet, too. Very different. Yeah.
How did you get interested in poetry originally, and then how did you get started writing poetry?
Well, I don't know where the idea. Well, I do know. Sort of two answers. I know and I don't know.
You were 9 years old.
I was 9. Thank you. Did I already say that? I was 9. I can't remember which happened first. So the first poem I wrote was when my grandmother had died, and I'm the youngest of a big family, and nobody wanted to talk to me about it. We're sort of embarrassed by things like death and passion in my family, and so having to explain death to a 9-year-old, no thank you. Just send him off, and let him watch some more Beverly Hillbillies, and throw some more popcorn his way. He seems to like eating. Let him do that. And so I sort of had to explain it to myself, and I did so in a poem, in which I tried. I was able to talk to myself in a register, and in a way that I didn't know I had. I was able to say things I didn't know that I thought, or ask questions I didn't know that I had. It was very different from normal speech. And they read it at the funeral, and so where I got the other the good or bad reinforcement that not only did I have access to a discourse that I didn't otherwise have, but that under certain conditions, people would listen and respond to it. That the words had force, and poetry had force. And I can't remember, and I don't want to know specifically which came first, and then we took a trip to Toronto, the only time we ever traveled that I remember. We might have gone to Mount Rushmore once, when my dad had some sort of conference, and we went to visit a friend of his daughter, who was a writer, and was married to a writer. And we spent the afternoon at their apartment in Toronto, and they were, it's 1979, they were, I don't know, 30, 35, had interesting art on the walls, batik and tie-dye, there's probably a faint odor of marijuana somewhere in the place, and Linda Spalding was her name, and Michael Ondaatje was her husband. It was before he was famous in America. He was Canada famous at the time, and he had kind of a big head of hair, and he was from Sri Lanka, but with a kind of British accent, like a wild kind of guy. And they were kind of hippies, and the sort of people that in Topeka we would do everything we could do to shield me from, But there, not only were they fun, good hosts and guests, but I remember on the subway back to our hotel asking trying to figure out why my parents were so deferential to these younger weirdos. I was like, well, what do they do? And my dad said, well, they're writers. It's like, I want to be a writer. Give me some of that. And that's what I've been chasing that dragon ever since. But I'm not sure actually which chronologically happened before the other. I suspect we went to visit Toronto, and then that put some seed in my head about poetry that then
Why was your
later
dad
that year.
interested in writers?
Well, I have a family of readers. A lot of my family, some of my family, were professionals, and some didn't finish school, but everybody is a reader, all my aunts and uncles and cousins doing all sorts of different things. Everybody, our church is the library and the church, but not primarily Central Congregational Church, which has since been demolished, and nobody seemed to go looking for a replacement. So, but if they knocked down the library, my family would be bereft. The Topeka Public Library. Yeah, they're readers. I mean, not of poetry, not of great stuff, but there's a lot of respect for books and writing and discourse. Mm-hmm.
I particularly liked your poem about the art museum. I worked at the Portland Art Museum when I was young, and you got all the characters. They work at the Portland Art Museum as well as working at your museum too.
Yeah.
Every one of them.
Yeah. Oh, it's a great milieu. I like
Yes.
workplaces.
And
Yeah.
they had terribly drab offices, and
Yeah.
the architect who designed the building made wonderful gallery space. He never thought to build offices.
Yeah. It's not a primary thing.
Yeah.
And nobody gets paid well in museums, but everybody has to
No,
have a
and
fancy degree,
I
So
too was hired for just general office work.
yeah.
Didn't have a clue of what I was doing, and people who were incredibly qualified that were just out of college had to work there for free because they were interns and doing apprenticeships.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they also had incredibly wealthy parents that would say, "That's okay, child. You go and
Yeah.
learn from the master."
Well, there's a lot of money.
What's that?
There's a lot of money in the nonprofits.
Oh yes, yes.
There's a lot of nonprofit in the
Yeah, so
nonprofits.
you were there for a year,
But
without pay, but
yeah.
they had families that would back them up, and
Yeah.
they could start their art career that way.
Yeah. Well, I like working in the art museum. I worked at a boarding school for a while, which was great. But I was always, careful not, sort of, that's what they call it, the jeweler's paradox, the jeweler's dilemma. Don't ever confuse yourself with your customers.
Right.
So, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about something you hinted at, and that was when your child was young and you only had a certain amount of time and you were working on the most recent published book, that you said something about, well, it makes sense. It had to make sense.
Yeah.
Do you not think that the books before and the forthcoming book?
I think I've always made sense. I think I still make sense, but it's not the kind of sense that would that I would be able to memorize or keep in my head, line by line, or sort of coalescing around a specific subject or a sequence, a logical sequence, a chronological sequence or
But do you
something.
think that's a bad thing?
No, I wish I had done it earlier. Yeah, no. Well, I mean, it was something I learned about. I mean, you learn a lot having kids, It's not the most important thing I've learned. But what I learned as a writer, being a parent, is not from the actual. I mean, I've learned a lot from, from love and responsibility, but learned a lot about just how the mind works. I know people who write. You may do that. You may write in your head. I think a lot of people who write, who pay attention to formal matters, find it not so difficult to compose in your head because there's something for your brain to hook onto, right? Form, rhyme, meter. So for me, I had to have really like a subject for it. Do anybody use the memory trick of? It's an old Greek memory trick of you count the numbers and you associate like. Instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you like sun. I've been using it for a long time, but I never say them out loud, right? Well, things that rhyme with it that are images, like sun, shoe, tree, door, hive, sticks, heaven. I imagine like a little bobblehead Jesus on a little dashboard Jesus, gate, sign, pen, right? And so if I try to memorize things, so I imagine I'm trying to remember like students' names, like I imagine like the sound of their name with the sun and where they sit, or try to remember things. So you can sort of put an image with that number, and then with time you can memorize things that it's sort of a trick. You can play tricks with memorization. And it's really cool, and I use that. And I write music. I can remember songs really well. But something about writing, I think my writing became richer when I had to make more of an effort to memorize it. Not that I recited from memory tonight, but had to live with the lines a little bit longer as I walked around, changing diapers or cleaning the house or picking up, pennies. Working, and not having the outlet of the notebook or the time to type it in, and having to live with an idea longer, I think made for a richer poetry, and I think some people learn that early. But when I was younger, I saw as has been hip to do for a while, seeing the real analogy for poetry being painting. And now I see more the analogy for poetry being song and music, which is a different place in the head. Yeah. Yeah.
Is it an avocation or a vocation?
For me,
For you?
sadly, a vocation.
Sadly.
Banjo is my backup. I really have chosen poorly. Except for choice of a spouse, which has allowed me to pursue it more than I might have otherwise. No, I've been dedicated since I was 9 years old. Nothing else for me. I never really thought about another thing, and whatever that leads to. So far, I'm not. As you can see, I ain't starving. I'm going to Weight Watchers, but. I'm 100% dedicated to poetry, and I think that is the only way that I could have lived my life. But I don't think it's the only way to be a poet. I don't necessarily encourage it to others. I don't think it's made me a better poet than I would have if I had, taken some other professional path early. I think I probably would have ended up writing just as much, but I didn't think so at the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It would have been better as a hobby.
That's the last question.
Okay.
Maybe that's a good place to end. Ed will be here for a while. There are some books back here.
Yeah.
So refreshments, so please help yourself. That's what they're for.
Thank you all very much
Thank you.
for your kind indulgence.